Yeah, and so really this point is for the man who remains unrepentant. Okay, so God has certain rights, but I deny those rights. I argue his right to rule over different areas of my life. I'm willing to give him this, but not this. And then if some Christian says to me, yes, but do you never fear the Lord? Is he not your dread? And the answer is no, because of a small view of him. But if we think how anything, even the thoughts of our minds that can torment us at night and we can't sleep, how easy it is for God to get our attention. And so I think one application of that, not only is that we might have a holy sense of God's dreadfulness outside of Christ and to the unrepentant, but also how merciful God is to us, that in a world of sin, we are so infrequently tormented, and God's kindnesses, the fact that I can sleep at night, or that my body does work, or that, my children are healthy, those things ought to crash against my indifference and wake me up and say, God could have tormented you to get your attention, and yet he uses his kindness. Another thing that, that a right view of God, a biblical view of God ought to do is it ought to remove sin's false advertising. It ought to just strip it of all of its prettiness. Here's another quote from Dwight. He says this: "Sin is an act of bold and unholy rebellion against God's righteous government." So here's a perfect king who always rules perfectly, and yet we are constantly in an unclean way fighting against it. Then he goes on to say, sin shows gross and dreadful ingratitude to God's goodness and mercy. Sin is an unholy disregard of God's perfect and glorious character. So whether we're talking about his government or his kindnesses or his own character, sin is constantly against him. One thing that Roberts used to mention every time he would come and preach is that you can see sin in one or two ways, and it depends on how you see God. Big God, little you, sin is a thief of his glory. That's what's so bad. Little God, big you, sin is a thing that might take you to an unpleasant place, that might bring unpleasant consequences to your life. A very different view of sin's nature.
I was thinking about this in terms of parent and child. If you're a parent, you can perhaps see in your children rebellion. If you have a rebellious child, the child doesn't show respect for your rules, and in doing that, he's not showing respect for the rule giver, and they disobey. They're disciplined, and then they're mad at you for disciplining them. Like, how dare you? You've assaulted my rights. I wasn't wrong. You were wrong. And ingratitude, just on and on. And it is an imperfect example or illustration, because even as you're pointing out the child's anger, you may have to repent and think, God, I'm angry too. Or ungrateful, me too. And the child might even land some blows. Son, you shouldn't be angry like that. But you get mad. So it is imperfect. But if you turn it around and think of we're children, and we often have no regard for God's law, especially as a lost person. No regard for God's law. No regard for the lawgiver. Ungrateful, etc. The least little thing happens, and we're sure God is just out to get us. Clearly, But there are no blows landed on God, He's not pointing out anger in us and at the same time having to repent of anger. He's perfect, he's good, he's holy. So that gap should make the weight of our sin all the greater. And his holiness, as I think you're saying, should both humble us, remove our pride, but also help us to see how terrible our sin is against God. It's not against someone who's out to get us. It's against a good and holy God.